The purpose of this video is to discuss two major ways that cells can die, which is why we have cell death up here as the title of the video. Now, the thing to consider is not all reasons cells can die are necessarily a bad thing. There's two main categories that cell death is broken up into. The first one is called necrosis, and this one is generally something negative for the cell. The cell is dying because of some type of insult or some type of problem that is happening in its environment. Necrosis is generally a bit more of a messy process, and we'll get into the details of some of that coming up in a moment. The other one is a process called apoptosis. Now, this is also a form of cells dying, but this is very normal. This happens every day inside of all living things, all multicellular living things anyway. And apoptosis is a normal and more organized process. So what we'll try to do in this video is go through and compare necrosis and apoptosis and explain the differences between these two processes that cells go through in order to die. I mentioned before that necrosis happens because of some type of an insult to the cell. Now, this insult can come in many different forms. One of the most simplistic ones is physical damage. So if there's physical damage that's done to the cell that the cell cannot repair from, it'll begin going through the process of necrosis, where it basically ruptures and like all of the parts of the cell kind of spill out into the area around it. The problem with physical damage is that it can cause inflammation and can negatively affect other cells in the surrounding area. So you've experienced this if you've had something as simple as getting a scratch on your hand. The scratch is an area where a bunch of cells are experiencing this physical damage, and around them, other cells are becoming inflamed, which is part of the reason why the area around the scratch gets red and sort of irritated. So the physical damage of those cells dying is disrupting some of the cells around them. Another thing that could cause this is pH. So if the cells are in a pH range that they're no longer tolerant of, that can begin the process of necrosis. One final example, and again, these are just a handful of the insults that a cell could be responding to. But one final example is a lack of oxygen. So this could happen to a person if they're having, say, like a stroke or a heart attack, and their circulation isn't working properly, and their cells aren't getting the appropriate amount of oxygen that they need. If the cell can't provide enough energy in the form of ATP, it'll start going through the process of necrosis. So all of these are very sort of messy and unfortunate ways of the cell to experience cell death. So messy is our final point here. The cell is rupturing and coming apart, and as the contents of the cell spill out into the surrounding area, it can inflame and then damage other cells. So necrosis is something that's happening based off of an insult, and it's something that's generally a much more negative process for the cell. It's only happening if bad things are going on. Like every single example we talked about is something that's a negative experience for the cell and for the organism overall. What you'll see about apoptosis in a moment is there's many reasons for this process to happen. Some of them are negative, but some of them are totally normal. So if we're looking at apoptosis as opposed to the process of necrosis, there's a few different reasons for cells to go through this process. We'll start off with the ones that are kind of similar to what we were talking about with necrosis. We said necrosis is usually the cell dying from some type of an insult or damage. So in apoptosis, there's another way that can happen as well. If there's DNA damage in the cell can go through the process of apoptosis. The other way of describing this one, apoptosis, is sometimes called programmed cell death or cell suicide. So it's a process of like self-destructing inside of the cell. The thing is, it is much more organized than what we were seeing with necrosis. Instead of the cell rupturing and displacing other cells around it, the cell kind of breaks up into small parts. These parts are called blebs. So believe it or not, that actually is a technical term. I'll add this one down for you. Blebs, B-L-E-B-S, is a technical term for the sort of budding that happens on the side of a cell. So if you've ever seen cells budding as a simple form of reproduction, it almost looks like that. Like little pieces of the cell are breaking off into smaller vacuoles that contain parts of the cell. So it's an organized way of taking the cell apart. So a way of comparing these two is necrosis is sort of this unorganized mess, whereas apoptosis is this very organized disassembly of the cell. So instead of the cell rupturing or coming apart in a very organized fashion, it comes apart in small pieces. Part of the reason why apoptosis is much more organized and controlled is because this is a normal thing that all living organisms experience at some way through the process of development. So we'll talk about one way this happens in an organism that everybody, I would imagine, is probably fairly familiar with. We have a tadpole here that will eventually develop into a frog. Now, part of that process is the tadpole losing its tail, and those tails then become sort of the hind legs in the frog. And the way that that tail goes away is through this process of apoptosis. Those cells are programmed to start to die at a certain point when the tadpole is going through its metamorphosis into becoming an adult. So this is a normal part of the development of the tadpole. It's not responding to any kind of insult like the cells were when they were going through necrosis. This is a normal part of the life cycle of what we're seeing with our tadpole. Another example of this taking place in development is with people. While you were developing inside of the womb, in between all of your fingers, there was a kind of webbing. And one of the things that goes on during development is this webbing that was between all of your fingers. That webbing starts to go away due to the process of apoptosis. So those cells are programmed to no longer develop during a certain point in the embryo's development overall. And instead of, I guess, really no longer developing, those cells are doing the opposite. They are going away. They're dying through the process of apoptosis. So this way you have the appropriate function of your hands once you're fully developed and then born as an infant. So the thing to consider with this one is that it's the exact opposite of what we were looking at in necrosis, in the sense that it is an organized process that occurs when the cell is actually programmed to die, either due to some type of DNA damage or just normal developmental causes. So I hope this video was helpful in going through and analyzing the two main processes that cells go through in order to die, looking at the differences between necrosis and apoptosis.